Thank you for joining us again as we continue to discuss municipal bond credit stresses, bankruptcies, and worse. The subtitle here is Puerto Rico, Lessons Learned and to be Learned from a Distressed Commonwealth. We are pleased to be able to ask Jim Spiotto of Chapman Strategic Advisors about his insights into lessons that can be learned from Puerto Rico's decades-long slide into overwhelming debt, as well as the recent market price tanking of Puerto Rican municipal bonds. Jim, you've indicated that no U.S. territory has ever filed for bankruptcy. Is there any constitutional or statutory prohibition against bankruptcy being used by Puerto Rican municipal entities?
Paul, the issue that's created there, and it's a little bit different than the states and municipalities. Puerto Rico is a territory, a protectorate, a commonwealth. It is, in essence, a sub-sovereign, not a co-sovereign with the federal government, because it is not the equivalent of a state in every way. The Bankruptcy Code does treat it similar to a state, except for the ability of its instrumentalities and agencies to file Chapter 9. They're not eligible as presently drafted in the Bankruptcy Code. Can that change? There presently is the commissioner from Puerto Rico to Congress who is suggesting and has introduced a bill to change the language to allow municipalities, in essence, in Puerto Rico to be able to file under Chapter 9. Whether that will pass is up to the Congress and whether or not they, as the sovereign and parent, will allow, just like every state has to allow or determine to allow its municipalities to file Chapter 9, the federal government will have to decide whether or not it will allow the Commonwealth to allow its municipalities to file. And that's a policy decision. We know in the case of D.C., which is somewhat similar to the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico in a sense, that when they had their financial difficulties in the 1990s, a financial control board structure and oversight was set up to help them work through it and to provide the supervision and hopefully motivation to do the right thing and structure so that you can solve the problem. The issue with Puerto Rico also is, they need a solution that addresses holistically their problem. They recently passed, a public corporation debt enforcement and recovery act, but that's just one issue of a bigger pie, so to speak. That slice, yes, it needs help, but they need to help their whole economy. And so you need a holistic approach. Chapter 9 may be preferable to the litigation that their present Debt Enforcement Recovery Act is undergoing, with challenges by bondholders as to whether or not it's legal and constitutional, because as we've mentioned before, the federal government is the one under our Constitution that can pass laws relating to bankruptcy and insolvency. And secondly, they are relying upon an old Supreme Court case coming out of the Depression that before the Bankruptcy Act was passed, New Jersey, for example, had in their Municipal Finance Act a provision for a refinancing type authority and structure where a local government could solicit a restructuring, and if their creditors would agree, a significant percentage, take it to a state court, get approval of it, and make it enforceable on all their creditors. And that was to apply to contractual debt, not to apply to anything. They even said it in the Supreme Court decision. It was the Asbury Park, the city of Asbury Park in New Jersey, that it wasn't to apply to debt restructurings of revenue bonds or that backed by tax revenue, only unsecured obligations of the municipality, or as the Supreme Court said, paper rights as opposed to property rights. So yes, it could happen. It may be better to do like D.C. and New York City and Cleveland and Philadelphia and Pittsburgh to work with the state and come up with a recovery plan, work with the federal government with an oversight commission, then go through a Chapter 9. But that's a policy issue for the federal government, and I think we'll see how it turns out. It's going to be something that will be front and center as Congress comes back into session in the fall of 2014, and we'll see whether or not they choose that. Meanwhile, what Puerto Rico has done is they have a standstill agreement with their creditors on their utilities, at least PREPA, in connection with working out whether and how they're going to deal with the problem. And like any other municipal problem, they have to determine what is sustainable and affordable, what revenues they have, what expenses they have, and what they can pay. And hopefully they'll find a solution before they need to think about bankruptcy or other solutions.
You mentioned the Islands Debt Recovery Act. Is that, in essence, a runaround or an end run around the fact that Chapter 9 is not available to Puerto Rican municipal entities, and an attempt to do something that's a de facto bankruptcy but not an actual bankruptcy?
I think that especially the bondholders who are contesting it in court very firmly believe that it is unconstitutional because only the federal government should pass laws. They're even arguing that it is preempted by federal law, that the bankruptcy code as presently written preempts them from doing this. Those are issues to be decided by a court. I think the real issue is the federal policy issue, that in Chapter 9 you have, for example, special revenues, which would apply right to PREPA, and the fact that the pledge of revenues to the bondholders would be treated in a Chapter 9 as special revenues more likely than not, and would be deemed unimpaired. And even as we've seen in Detroit, where they tried various forms of nicking and otherwise molesting the water and sewer bonds with their special revenues, in the end they did a tender offer to those who wanted it, and the rest they're claiming now will be unimpaired. Water and sewer bonds, special revenue bonds, whether it's Vallejo, Stockton, and even I think in Detroit now, they're not to be impaired. And so I think the real issue with regard to PREPA is the question of Chapter 9 and the federal policy of not impairing special revenue bonds. And that goes to the whole issue that I think the bondholders are raising too. You're taking property away from us, our pledged revenues, without just compensation and due process. Or two, and that's yet to be determined. That has not been determined that they're actually doing it. That's the fear. And two, the other issue is that you're creating something to supplant the federal policy of special revenues in Chapter 9, which we sort of bought into in buying these revenue bonds, which is the tradition in the market. All that can be superseded by finding a peaceful resolution, a consensual resolution between the parties in PREPA and the other public corporations. Hopefully that's what will happen, and we'll never really ever get into whether or not one thing is constitutional, whether it impairs contract rights, or whether it's a taking of property.
Looking back, and this is probably more an economic question than it is a legal question, but could the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico have prevented the current crisis in Puerto Rican municipal bonds, and if so, how?
Well, again, hindsight's always 20/20. But there are a lot of things that we can always say we wish we would have done. Obviously, trying to address some of these issues and addressing the need to borrow, the use of the funds, efficiency in government, and preventing waste are always issues that we wish we had a second shot like golf on in municipal finance. However, I think that there are some things even on the federal level that we can do. One of the problems they have is the cost of goods in Puerto Rico is higher because we have the Jones Act, which was passed. Remember, Puerto Rico came in 1917. The Jones Act, which had been in Congress kicking around, came in 1920. No one really connected the dots that if you're going to put goods at a U.S. port and then also drop off goods on the same ship in a Puerto Rican port, that the Puerto Rico port, there shouldn't be a tariff on those goods, which the Jones Act would increase the price. So there's a lot of complaints that the second stopping in Puerto Rico raises the cost of goods for Puerto Rico. You also have 936, which gave tax breaks to companies that go to Puerto Rico, create the jobs, and create a manufacturing or other business in Puerto Rico for the benefit of all. In 2006, that was taken away. Obviously, that crutch was helpful. They built business based upon that, and whether or not that should be returned or similar benefits to attract business in Puerto Rico. NAFTA, which we were trying to do a good with, created more of a benefit to Mexico than it did to Puerto Rico, because Puerto Rico is part of the United States for those purposes, and therefore, if there's a choice, the lower employer and the employer to be picked is Mexico. I think we have to now say for NAFTA and other trade relation issues that we have and treaties, Puerto Rico should be an exception. We should do what we can to stimulate business, and if you have manufacturing opportunities, it is far better to do it in Puerto Rico than anywhere else off the continental U.S. Or if you're going to move out of a state. So I think there are different ways in which it can be approached and different things that Congress and Puerto Rico can do. They have cut their budget. They have addressed some of their pension issues with their workers, and they're trying to work through these things. But unfortunately, more is needed, I think, in their recognition. And with the cooperation, hopefully both the federal government and their various creditor constituencies, they'll find a way to find a solution.
It is no secret that Puerto Rico has a problem with compliance with income taxes. Jim, in your opinion, does Puerto Rico's substantial untaxed underground economy make it so atypical that the island's financing lessons are not directly applicable to the rest of the U.S.?
I think the best way to look at that is to understand the virtues of the United States and its tax collection structure. We have one of the best tax collecting systems in the world, which is basically voluntary. And because of that, we have collected, and our collection rate is far better than most anyone else. Other governments have, whether you call it coercive or highly supervisory systems to ensure people pay their taxes. One of the issues that we realize when governments fail, such as Greece, that their system of collection is more abuse and less collection. And that's what, if you're going to be an established government, you need to bring in all sources of revenue, as our income tax code says, income from whatever sources that are available, and make sure everyone realizes it is in their best interest to participate. Because if you don't, you threaten not only others, but you threaten your own self. Because you may not be paying taxes, but you're not going to have the essential services and infrastructure. You won't have the investment in the future that you need for your environment, your community, your city, your Commonwealth to thrive and survive. So yes, the subterranean use of money should be brought into the sunlight and shared so that everyone benefits.
And there will be more observations by Jim Spiotto in the next part.